You step onto the damp, bustling docks of Venice in the year 1524, and the air just, it immediately hits you.
Oh, yeah.
It is heavy. It's thick with the smell of sea salt, the musk of rough-hewn timber, and that sharp, almost biting tang of exotic spices being unloaded from the galleys.
Right.
And this massive merchant vessel is creaking and groaning as it pulls into port, its wooden side just scraping against the barnacle-covered pilings. It has come from the east to deposit a traveler onto these wet stones, a traveler who is about to, well, completely upend global geopolitics.
And I mean, this traveler looks like absolutely no ambassador the Venetians have ever encountered before.
Not even close.
He is short. He's remarkably thin, just emaciated from travel. His body is covered in this map of battle scars, and his skin is described in the records of the time as being, quote, black as a Nubian.
Wow.
Yeah. And he carries no royal seals, speaks no Italian, no Latin. He communicates only in Arabic and Hebrew.
So, okay, let's unpack this for a second, because the pitch this man makes to the rulers of Europe is absolutely explosive.
It really is.
His name is David Reubeni. He steps off this boat and announces to literally anyone who will listen that he is the commander of a massive 300,000-strong Jewish army.
A huge force.
Right. He claims they are the lost tribes of Reuben, Gad, and Manasseh, hidden away in the deserts of Habor. And he says he was sent by his brother, King Joseph, to negotiate for heavy European weaponry.
It sounds like the plot of a high fantasy novel, right?
Totally.
Like a hidden desert kingdom, a lost army, a warrior prince arriving to secure arms. But what makes this deep dive so incredible is that this isn't fantasy. It is heavily documented history.
We actually have the receipts.
Quite literally, yeah, in the form of a travelogue.
And that travelogue is our source material for today. We're looking really closely at the translation by historian Alan Verskin, which is titled Diary of a Black Jewish Messiah.
Such a fascinating text.
It is. And our mission for this deep dive is to unpack exactly how this 16th century diplomat and, let's be honest, likely a brilliant grifter used deep theological knowledge and just masterful psychological leverage to completely captivate a traumatized world.
Yeah, we really need to look at the mechanics of his deception, how he pulled it off day to day, and why the most powerful monarchs in Europe just fell for it.
Exactly.
What's fascinating here is how the diary completely shatters our modern expectations of what, a holy man or a messianic figure is supposed to be.
Right.
But before we get into his actual tactics, we have to establish the ground reality of the world he was walking into. We need to understand the mechanism of why Reubeni wasn't immediately just tossed into a Venetian canal for making such outrageous claims.
Well, the European Jewish community in 1524 was living through an absolute geopolitical and spiritual nightmare.
Absolutely.
Just a few decades prior, in 1492, Spain enacted this brutal edict expelling its entire Jewish population. I mean, hundreds of thousands of people were stripped of their wealth, their homes, and just faced into exile.
And if we connect this to the bigger picture, you really have to look at the domino effect of that.
Right, because they didn't just disappear.
Exactly. The refugees fled into neighboring Portugal. But then in 1497, Portugal didn't just expel them. King Manuel I enacted forced mass conversions.
Oh, wow.
Jewish children were literally dragged to baptismal fonts.
Which, of course, created this massive population of Converso's crypto-Jews who were outwardly practicing Catholicism, but secretly trying to maintain their Jewish faith behind closed doors.
Yeah.
And they were living in absolute terror of the Inquisition. The psychological toll of that is just staggering to think about.
Oh, it's unimaginable.
You were constantly policing your own behavior. One neighbor noticing you didn't light a fire on a Saturday, or that you refused a plate of pork, and you are dragged into a tribunal, tortured, and potentially burned at the stake.
Oh. The Jewish world was physically and psychologically shattered. And this historical trauma, it perfectly matched classical Jewish texts.
Oh, really? In what way?
Well, if you look at Talmud Tractate Sanhedrin 97a, there is a very specific, incredibly bleak prophecy about the conditions of the world right before the Messiah arrives.
Okay.
The Talmud states that the Messiah will come in a generation where, quote, eyes fail with sorrow and grief and where harsh decrees are constantly multiplying.
Wow. So the community of 1524 is reading that text, looking around at the expulsions, the forced baptisms, the literal fires of the Inquisition, and they are basically checking every single box.
Every single one.
Their lived reality is matching the darkest prophecies of their tradition.
They were completely primed for salvation.
And then David Reubeni shows up. But, notice the specific brand of salvation he offers.
Right, it's very distinct.
He doesn't offer a spiritual awakening. He doesn't offer inner peace or some mystical transcendence. He offers a massive, muscular, heavily armed Jewish military.
Yeah, it's essentially a massive geopolitical short squeeze.
I love that analogy. It's like a parched forest in a drought, right? The Jewish community has been entirely bankrupted of political and physical power. They're living on the absolute margins.
Yes.
So the valuation of any promised military sovereignty just goes through the roof. When a community's only remaining currency is hope, a man walking into town offering an army holds an absolute monopoly on their survival. It's like an intoxicating drug.
Intoxicating is the perfect word for that dynamic. When your physical survival is on the line, critical thinking just takes a backseat.
For sure.
And he anchors this physical promise in the biblical text itself. Deuteronomy 30, verses 3 and 4, explicitly promises that God will gather the outcasts from the uttermost parts of heaven.
Oh, okay.
So to European Jews who had spent centuries living at the mercy of foreign kings, Reubeni's claim of sovereign, lost tribes living freely in the desert, that was the physical manifestation of this gathering.
But, okay, this raises a huge mechanical question for me. So if he knew they were so desperate for a Messiah, and they were actively projecting all of these biblical prophecies onto him, why didn't he just claim to be the Messiah? Wouldn't that have been easier?
See, this raises such an important question, and it's where Reubeni's absolute genius truly shines. You read his own diary, and he does the exact opposite.
Really?
He explicitly shuts down his followers. There is a shocking entry where people are revering him, throwing themselves at his feet, and he writes in his journal, quote, "I am not the Messiah. I am a greater sinner. I have killed many people. I am merely an army commander."
Oh, wow.
He is actively refusing the title.
Here's where it gets really interesting, though. Because refusing the title is actually a calculated diplomatic strategy, isn't it?
Yeah.
He's exploiting a very specific legal loophole.
He absolutely is. Reubeni, or, well, whoever was advising him, because he clearly had deep knowledge of Jewish law, understood a brilliant theological loophole established by Maimonides. Exactly, the great medieval philosopher and legal scholar known as the Rambam. In his monumental code of law, the Mishneh Torah, specifically in Hilchot Melachim chapter 11, Maimonides lays out a highly pragmatic test for identifying the Messiah.
Right.
Maimonides was historically terrified of false prophets leading the people astray with cheap magic tricks. So, he instituted a rule. The Messiah does not need to perform supernatural miracles. He doesn't need to part seas or resurrect the dead.
So he's essentially applying for the job of campaign manager rather than savior.
Yes.
By doing that, he completely bypasses the strict theological background check. Maimonides basically said, we don't need a magician, we need a general.
And Maimonides even cites the historical precedent of Rabbi Akiva, who threw his support behind Bar Kokhba, a fierce military leader who fought the Romans in the 2nd century.
Oh, right.
Akiva didn't ask Bar Kokhba for a single miracle. He saw a general fighting for Jewish sovereignty and declared him the Messiah based solely on his military campaigns. So Reubeni's claim to be merely an army commander securing weapons was an incredibly savvy long game.
Because if he claimed to be the Messiah and failed to deliver an immediate miraculous redemption, the strict rabbinic authorities would have him executed as a false prophet.
Exactly.
But by saying, hey, I'm just a general doing the logistics for the coming war, he shields himself legally from the rabbis, while simultaneously, sort of winking at the desperate masses so they can project their messianic dreams onto him anyway.
And we actually see this dual narrative play out in the daily grind recorded in his diary. Alan Verskin's translation shows us the really gritty reality of maintaining this grist.
The day-to-day stuff is wild.
Reubeni didn't just walk into a palace. He had to manufacture the illusion of diplomatic power completely out of thin air. How did a penniless traveler do that?
Well, by weaponizing asceticism and silence. Right.
Precisely.
The diary details how he would arrive in a city, refuse to stay in the luxurious homes of the wealthy Jewish bankers, and instead isolate himself in these sparse quarters. He would fast constantly.
Yeah, he claimed he was fasting for spiritual reasons.
But functionally, it meant he didn't have to explain his dietary habits or risk eating something non-kosher that would blow his cover as a pious leader.
It was brilliant. And he forced the wealthy bankers to come to him. He demanded to be treated like royalty. By acting completely aloof, speaking only through interpreters in Hebrew and Arabic, he created this vacuum of information.
And nature abhors a vacuum.
Exactly. The less he explained, the more the local Jewish elite convinced themselves he must be real. They ultimately funded his massive expedition to Rome, they bought him the expensive clothes, hired his retinue of servants, and funded the bribes he needed to access the Vatican.
Which brings us to the optics of his success, because it is staggering. With the backing of these Italian Jewish bankers, Reubeni manages to ride a white horse right through the streets of Rome.
It's an incredible image.
A dark-skinned Jewish warrior claiming to represent a hidden desert army, riding a white horse into the heart of Christendom. And he actually secures an audience with Pope Clement VII.
And the mechanics of that meeting are just pure geopolitics. We tend to view the Pope solely as a religious figure, but Clement VII was a head of state facing an existential threat.
The Ottomans.
Right. Suleiman the Magnificent and the expanding Ottoman Empire were marching through Europe. They had recently taken Belgrade and Rhodes. Christian Europe was terrified.
So when this exotic diplomat arrives offering an alliance with a hidden Eastern army to attack the Ottomans from the rear, which is a classic pincer movement, the Pope's strategic desperation just overrides his skepticism.
It totally does.
Reubeni tapped into a long-standing European fantasy of an Eastern ally, like the mythical Prester John, coming to save Christendom.
Reubeni gave the Pope exactly what he wanted to hear, and it worked. The Pope gave Reubeni official letters of introduction to King João III of Portugal so they could discuss a joint military alliance.
That's insane.
Reubeni walked out of the Vatican with a papal mandate.
But this geopolitical peak is exactly where the pragmatic strategy begins to unravel.
Unfortunately, yes.
Reubeni's theological loophole worked flawlessly for the Vatican, but it ignited a spiritual fire in the streets that he absolutely could not control.
When Reubeni arrived in Portugal, armed with letters from the Pope, the Converso community there, the people living in daily terror of the Inquisition, saw him, and they just abandoned all caution.
They were so desperate.
To them, the white horse, the papal letters, the talk of a Jewish army, well, it was undeniable proof that their suffering was about to end.
And this brings us to the tragedy of Diogo Pires.
Yes.
Diogo was a brilliant, highly successful high court secretary in Portugal. He was a converso, outwardly living a wealthy, integrated Christian life with direct access to the royal court. But he was so profoundly moved by Reubeni's arrival that he took a terrifying, frankly irreversible step.
He really did.
He circumcised himself, changed his name to Solon Molcho, and publicly declared his return to Judaism.
And, in 16th century Portugal, under the eyes of King João III, circumcising yourself and reverting to Judaism was not just a religious statement. It was a capital offense. It was an automatic, non-negotiable death warrant. And to understand why this was such a disaster for Reubeni's diplomatic mission, we have to look at another Talmudic text, Ketubot 111a.
Let's get into the mechanics of that, because it explains the exact tension between Reubeni's strategy and Molcho's fanaticism.
So Ketubot 111a outlines the 3 oaths that Israel swore to God when they went into exile. 2 of those oaths are crucial here. 1, that the Jewish people would not violently rebel against the nations where they lived.
Right.
And 2, that they would not force the end of days, meaning they would not try to artificially trigger the Messianic age through extreme actions.
And Molcho just shattered those oaths.
Completely.
Reubeni was engaging in careful, pragmatic political theater. It was a high-wire act of diplomacy requiring absolute discipline. Molcho took that theater, believed it with his entire soul, and made it a highly dangerous spiritual reality right in the king's backyard.
You read Reubeni's diary from this moment, and you can feel the absolute panic setting in.
He must have been terrified.
He is furious. He writes about how Molcho's public return to Judaism is going to ruin the entire diplomatic mission. And, well, he was completely correct.
Yeah.
King João III was already suspicious. When a high court secretary suddenly circumcises himself, the king assumes Reubeni is secretly trying to subvert the state and convert the Christianized Jews back to their old faith. The king just expels Reubeni from Portugal.
Which, makes me want to push back on a historical narrative here.
Oh, go for it.
History often romanticizes Solomon Molcho as this great spiritual visionary, this martyr who courageously returned to his roots. But based on Reubeni's diary, wasn't Molcho actually just a reckless liability?
That's a strong call.
Reubeni's grand downfall wasn't because he was outsmarted by his European enemies. It was because his biggest fan, completely ignored his pragmatic strategy, lacked the discipline to play the long game, and blew up a diplomatic masterclass.
It is a phenomenal point of debate, really. If you view Reubeni strictly as a diplomat trying to secure the safety of his people through geopolitical alliances, then yes, Molcho was a catastrophic liability.
Right.
Molcho lacked the discipline to play the game. He forced an issue that required subtlety. But if you view this through the lens of a traumatized people starving for authenticity, Molcho represents the sheer, unstoppable force of the human spirit.
That's true.
He refused to live a double life anymore. Reubeni tried to control the narrative of redemption, but redemption, once sparked, is not something you can easily manage on a diplomatic timetable.
And the fallout is just devastating. Reubeni's slow, careful statecraft was completely blown up by Molcho's mystical urgency, and their stories become tragically intertwined.
They do.
Later on, Reubeni and Molcho actually reunite. They travel together to Germany, basically doubling down on the grift, or the mission, depending on how you view it. They pitch the Holy Roman Emperor, Charles V, on the idea of arming Jews against the Turks.
Charles V, however, was not Pope Clement.
No, he was not.
He was not entertained by this pitch, nor did he feel the same immediate strategic desperation in that moment. Charles V had them arrested, threw them in chains, and handed them straight over to the Inquisition.
Wow.
The outcome was exactly what Reubeni had feared from the moment Molcho circumcised himself in Portugal. Solomon Molcho, refusing to renounce his Judaism, was burned at the stake in 1532.
And David Reubeni, the man who started it all, rotted in a Spanish prison and likely met the exact same fiery fate a few years later in 1538.
Which brings us back to the diary itself. Alan Verskin makes a brilliant observation about the text that grounds this entire story. The diary is written in this energetic, everyday, rough-and-tumble Hebrew.
But very grounded.
Right. It's not a polished theological treatise. It doesn't read like scripture at all.
So what does this all mean for us today? The diary is a record of the daily grind. It's about being hungry on the road, suffering from travel sickness, dodging bandits, arguing with insubordinate servants, fearing the authorities, and just maintaining the sheer, stubborn refusal to back down from the Khan.
And that is where the immense value lies for you, the listener, in unpacking this history. It is a masterclass in the mechanics of belief.
Absolutely.
It shows us how psychological leverage, combined with deep textual knowledge and the raw power of human imagination, can literally alter the course of geopolitics.
Even if it was only for a brief moment.
Exactly. A scarred traveler with no actual army managed to exploit the blind spots of the Pope and the kings of Europe simply by understanding exactly what they needed to believe.
It leaves you with this final, really provocative thought to mull over. If an elaborate manufactured narrative, a brilliant grift, is the only thing that can give a broken, traumatized people the hope they desperately need to survive another day under the shadow of the Inquisition, at what point does that grift actually become a genuine act of salvation?
That's the real question, isn't it?
Does the historical truth of the messenger even matter if the hope they provide is absolutely real?
When survival is on the line between a lie that saves you and a truth that damns you becomes very thin indeed.
Something to think about the next time you find yourself standing on the damp, heavy-scented docks of Venice, watching a ship pull in from the horizon, wondering what kind of stories the passengers might be carrying,